Welcome to the Who Wants to Brawl YouTube channel. That is not a question, that is a statement. My name is Who, and I'm letting you know I want to brawl. Today, we have a new deck tech for you. We're going to be talking about Zilortha, Strength Incarnate. It is 3, a green, and a red for a 7/3 Trampler, but it says lethal damage dealt to creatures that I control is determined by their power rather than their toughness. So this deck is all about high power creatures, and it's going to be a fun one to play. Let's get started.
So some strategies for this deck are, first, we got to ramp. We got to make sure we hit our big creatures. Second, we're going to beat face with our smaller creatures. Then, once we have our big creatures on the table, we're going to use their power to draw some cards. And then, we're going to beat face. And then we're going to destroy our opponent's cards and their creatures through our creature's power. And then, to round it out, we're going to beat face again. The first strategy we're going to talk about today is ramp. We have a lot of high casting cost creatures in our deck, so we got to make sure that we hit all of our mana and hit a few more along the way. First up, we have Arcane Signet. It's the premier ramp card in the entire Brawl format at the moment. It's 2 mana for an artifact, taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. Next up, we have Elysian Caryatid. It taps to add 1 mana of any color, but if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, which is the goal of this deck, it taps to add 2 mana of this color instead. Perfect for this deck. Lets us get out our big creatures early, and then once we have them, keep casting even more, hopefully overwhelm our opponents. Next up, we have Cultivate. It's 3 mana, search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped, the other in your hand. This is perfect for fixing. We always want to see this card. Next up, we have Llanowar Visionary, which is for 1 green and 2 colorless. Enters the battlefield, draw a card, and taps to add a green. It's a way of refilling our hand and ramping out at the same time. It's 3 mana, but it's still perfectly fine for this deck. Next up, we have Tangled Florahedron, which is 1 green and a colorless for a 1/1 that taps to add green, just a generic mana dork, but it also comes in with the option to play it as a land, which is perfect for the late game when we don't actually need the ramp anymore, but perfect early when we need ramp a lot. Next up, we have Lotus Cobra, which for green and a colorless is a 2/1 snake, and it has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any color. This is perfect in this deck. It makes every land we play give an additional mana, which is just what we need to get our Zilortha a little bit earlier and start making everything swing with more efficiency. Next up, it's time to draw. As with any deck that likes to put out a lot of creatures, it's very susceptible to removal, and drawing cards is the perfect antidote to making sure we don't burn out. First up, we have Furious Rise, which is a 3 mana enchantment. At the beginning of our end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. Similarly, we have Garruk's Uprising, which is a 3 mana enchantment that when it enters a battlefield, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we draw a card. Garruk's Uprising is a little bit better in the late game, because we're probably going to draw that card immediately versus with Furious Rise at the end of the turn. This way with Garruk's Uprising, we can cast the card that we draw, at least most likely. And then just as importantly, it gives our creatures trample. We have a lot of high power creatures in this deck, and letting them run over our opponent's creatures just might give us the extra push we need to secure the victory. But on top of that, Garruk's Uprising isn't done yet. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under our control, we draw another card. Very useful card all around. Next up, we have Return of the Wild Speaker, which is a 5 mana instant that we can choose one. Draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures we control, or non-human creatures we control get +3/+3. More often than not, we're going to choose draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-humans we control, Most of the time this means Zilortha himself, this is 5 mana to draw 7 cards at instant speed. You can't really beat that. But our next card tries with the Great Henge. It's green and 7 colorless for a legendary artifact, but it costs X less to cast, where X is the greatest power among creatures I control, which our commander just happens to make it cost 7 colorless less. And it taps to add green and gain 2 life. But most importantly for our deck, whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under our control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature and draw a card. So this turns any creature we play into an extra card, which is so perfect to make sure we're not running out of steam. Our next strategy involves the little ones. While it is not a major component of the deck, having smaller creatures that are still useful to our strategy makes the deck flow a little bit more smoothly, allowing us to get to the late game. Each of these creatures has a higher power than toughness, allowing Zilortha to increase their toughness upon entering the battlefield. First up, we have Careless Celebrant, which is 2 mana for a 2/1 that deals 2 damage to a creature when it dies. Perfect for stalling, even getting a 2-for-1, or trading up in the right situation. Next, we have Rimrock Knight, which is 2 mana for a 3/1 that can't block, but also has an adventure we can cast for a single red mana that gives a creature +2/+0. In the early game, this puts pressure on our opponent for our bigger creatures to finish the job. But the best part of this card is it essentially gives a creature +2/+2 while Zilortha is out, allowing us to win combat we may have just traded before. Next, we have Underworld Ragehound, a 2 mana 3/1 that must attack but can escape from the graveyard in the later game. This is an overall difficult creature to deal with when you increase its toughness the way Zilortha will when it hits the battlefield. And finally, we have Fissure Wizard, which for a red and a colorless is a 2/1 that you may discard a card as it enters the battlefield to draw a card. This card really helps smooth out our land drops in the early game, allowing us to discard a non-land card and hopefully draw into a land. But in the later game, this allows us to discard our land so that way we can avoid flooding. Next, we have some 3 mana 4/4s. Or at least they're 4/4s with Zilortha out. This gives us great increase to our tempo, and making our creatures that much more difficult to block can grind out the win. Our first 3 mana 4/4 is Bonecrusher Giant. When it becomes targeted, it hits the controller of that spell for 2 damage. Careful that if we target it with a pump spell, it does do that damage to us. We can also cast it for its adventure cost and hit any target for 2. Removing pesky early creatures. The prevent damage clause doesn't come up often, but it can help when it does. Next, we have Garruk's Harbinger, which for green and 1 is a 4/3 that has hexproof from black, and when it deals combat damage to an opponent, we look at that many cards. So if we pump it, we can look at even more cards. Then reveal a creature or a Garruk Planeswalker, which FYI there are none in this deck, and put it into our hand. So this creature can also draw us cards on top of being just an efficient creature on the battlefield. Next, we have Loathsome Chimera. For 2 and a green is a 4/1. Later in the game, it can also escape with a +1/+1 counter, essentially making it a 5/5 later in the game. Then we have 3 cards, Aunaki Ogre, Frenzied Raptor, and Wildwood Patrol, that are each 4/2s. While the Wildwood Patrol has the bonus of Trample, these creatures are not that great at 2 toughness, but once Zilortha hits the battlefield and they become 4/4s, they become very efficient creatures and much more devastating to deal with. And now it's time for the moment we've been waiting for, the primary strategy of the deck, the massive creatures. First, we have Renata, Call to the Hunt. This creature makes all our creatures bigger when they enter the battlefield. And when Zilortha is on the battlefield, this card can become enormous very fast, as its power and toughness each become equal to your devotion to green, which most of our big creatures are green. Then we have Terror of the Peaks, which is a 5/4 flyer for 3 red. Just targeting it requires 3 life, then on top of that, it can deal damage to anything equal to all of our creatures' power as they enter the battlefield. In a deck that ramps and has large, powerful creatures, this can get out of hand in a hurry. Then next, we have Nessian Boar. Nice. Finally, we have Kogla, the Titan Ape. This is a Brawl staple, and in this deck can even survive against 6 power creatures, giving it a huge advantage with this deck. Our next strategy involves eliminating our opponent's threats. First, we have Ram Through and Hunter's Edge, which each deal damage to an opponent's creature equal to a creature we control's power. Then we have Wilt, which is 2 mana that destroys an artifact or enchantment, but it also cycles for 2. I believe this card should be in any Brawl deck that has green in it, as it has such a high upside of eliminating a major threat, but also has a fail case so that you can just cycle it away and draw another card. And then we have Thundering Rebuke, which is 2 mana to deal 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker, just an efficient removal spell. And then we have Storm's Wrath, which is 4 mana to deal 4 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. A lot of our bigger creatures will survive Storm's Wrath, making an even better removal for this deck. Our last strategy will round out the deck with some utility pieces. Our first utility piece is Battle Rattle Shaman. It's a 2/2 for 3 and a red that gives one of our creatures +2/+0 until end of turn. Turning that into +2/+2 can be absolutely devastating for our opponents, causing us to win far more combats than we otherwise would have. Next, we have Embereth Skyblazer, which is 4 mana for a 4/3 that has flying on our turn. When it attacks, we can pay 3 mana to give our creatures essentially +1/+1. It's not the most efficient card, but can swing the game when we're at parity, and can finish the game by making our attacks just a little bit harder to block. Next, we have Scavenged Blade, which is an equipment for 1 and a red that attaches to a creature when it enters the battlefield, and gives +2 power. Then there's Rada, Heart of Keld. As one of the most popular commanders in Brawl, it's also a great utility piece in any deck that can run her. Be a difficult creature to block at any point with First Strike, and helps ensure we hit those ever-important early land drops. Next is Colossal Might, which kinda speaks for itself, allowing us to draw a card on our upkeep if we have a creature with power 4 or greater. Then we have Questing Beast. As a 4 mana 4/4 with Death Touch, Vigilance, and Haste, it's difficult to block, difficult to attack into, and can also help us get rid of some of those pesky planeswalkers, which is especially important in a format that allows our opponents to start with a planeswalker. And then our final utility piece is Ogre Battle Driver, a 4 mana 3/3 that gives our creatures +2/+0 and haste as they enter the battlefield. Giving our creatures this power bonus and haste can win us the game out of absolutely nowhere. And finally, we have our land. First, we have Castle Garenbrig, which will help us ramp out a little bit. Then Castle Embereth, which is a low downside land that taps for red, but also gives our creatures a power bonus, which in this deck can also be a toughness bonus, which can be absolutely devastating for our opponents coming from a land. Then, for fixing purposes, we have Command Tower, Fabled Passage, Temple of Abandon, Rugged Highlands, and Crag Crown Pathway. Bonder's Enclave can help us draw cards in a pinch if we're flooding out, as long as we have a creature with power 4 or greater. And that's Zilortha, Strength Incarnate. If you like this video, be sure to like and share it with a friend. Hit the subscribe button to get more Brawl content from me. Also, check me out on Twitch on Sundays at 11 to 1, where I go over last week's deck tech. Mondays at 8 p.m., where I will usually play previous decks and or do drafts. And then I also try to stream a random night of the week. Sometimes I play Magic, sometimes I don't. Also, follow me on social media on Twitter at WhoWantsToBrawl, and then you can email me at whowantstobrawl@gmail.com. Thanks, guys, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.